1946, rural Bavaria. In a village where church bells had survived what the front had never reached, a tractor stood idle as men argued in the courtyard of the Meyer farm. The mayor unfolded a stamped order on cheap paper, accommodation to be provided, one refugee family from Silesia, barn to be cleared, quarters to be made available immediately. The farmer clenched his jaw. "We barely have space for our own," he muttered. "Now they send us more mouths. From God knows where?" Into this resentment walked a man in a threadbare coat, his wife and 2 children. On the wagon behind them, 2 trunks, a sack of bedding, a small wooden box they refused to let out of sight. His name in church records would later appear as Johann Kowalski, Genannt Keller, called Keller. The clerk adding a more German-sounding name in pencil. The clerk adding a more German-sounding name in pencil. In his notebook, begun in the weeks of their flight and continued in the barn loft that now passed for home, he wrote, "They call us vertriebene expellees. We had a house, a church, a graveyard. Now we are just mouths and luggage." The war for this Bavarian village had been air raid sirens in the distance, sons called up and some never returning, prisoners trudging through. For Johann's family, the war had been something else entirely, front lines rolling over their Silesian town, Red Army soldiers pounding on doors at night, columns of civilians marching west until their feet bled. Now, these 2 histories of suffering collided under one roof, the house that no longer existed, except in memory. Before 1945, Johann's world was not a problem of displaced persons. It was a brick house in a Silesian town where German and Polish names overlapped, a small carpentry workshop behind it, a chest with baptism certificates in Gothic script. On Sundays, church bells called people in 2 languages, but the liturgy was German. The map called it part of Germany. Older people remembered when the map had called it something else. From 1933 on, politics seeped in. Swastika flags appeared on official buildings. Poles in the area felt pressure. Jews were pushed out, then vanished entirely. Johann kept his head down, built furniture, raised children. He did not join the party. He also did not protest when Jewish neighbors' shop windows remained dark. The war first arrived as newsprint, victories in Poland, France, Russia. Then as telegrams, a cousin missing at Stalingrad, a neighbor's son killed near Leningrad. By 1944-45, it arrived as refugees streaming through from farther east, rumors of the Red Army's revenge. Posters still told them to hold fast. Reality prepared something else. The order to leave and the arithmetic of what to carry. January 1945. The snow around their Silesian town was grey with ash from distant fires. Word spread that Soviet troops had crossed the Oder. Local Nazi officials, who for years had promised that the front would never reach them, suddenly barked new orders: evacuation, take what you can carry, leave within 48 hours. The arithmetic was brutal and immediate. How do you reduce a life to 1 trunk, 1 box? As many blankets as you can strap to a cart. Johann and his wife laid their possessions on the floor. What could not be? The kitchen cupboard he had built himself, the pear tree in the yard, the grave of their infant son. They chose instead clothes, bread, the box with documents, birth, marriage, land deeds. He wrote, "We believed that with papers we could prove who we are. We believed that with papers we could prove who we are." We did not understand yet that in the new Europe, papers would matter less than where soldiers decided borders lie. They joined a column. Old people pushed on sleds, cows driven alongside carts, a scattering of soldiers attempting to keep order, then disappearing when Soviet artillery grew louder. On the road, labels changed. Yesterday, they had been Heimat, residents of a homeland, residents of a homeland. Today, they were Trek, refugees, soon expellees. Not people belonging to a place, but cargo to be moved. Flight and the collapse of certainty. Days blurred into a procession of frozen ditches, burned farmhouses, villages that offered water but no shelter. Red Army columns overtook them, passed them, sometimes broke into them. They saw women dragged from carts, men beaten for watches, boots, sometimes for nothing at all. The propaganda that had dehumanized the enemy for years now rebounded in crude justice. Where German armies had done as they pleased in Poland and Russia, Soviet soldiers now did as they pleased in Silesia. Johann kept his family moving, eyes down. He bartered his wedding ring for a sack of potatoes, his good boots for a horse so his wife could sit when her feet bled. At a hastily established way station, an official with an armband wrote their names on a list under a new heading, Evacuierte aus Oberschlesien, evacuees from Upper Silesia. Rows of names, towns, numbers. No column 4, the smell of the kitchen in summer, the sound of bells in their old church. They reduced our lives to line items, he later wrote. We were becoming statistics before we understood what we had lost. By the time they reached what had once been central Germany, the Reich itself was collapsing. News filtered through. Hitler dead. Berlin fallen. Unconditional surrender. For Johann, these were not the end of the war. They were the beginning of permanent displacement. From evacuees to expellees, borders move, people follow. The Allies met at Yalta and Potsdam, lines were drawn on maps, Silesia, East Prussia, Pomerania transferred to Polish administration. Ethnic Germans to be transferred west in an orderly and humane manner. The language was diplomatic. The reality in 1945-46 was anything but. Johann's family, who had fled ahead of the Red Army, were now in limbo in the Western occupation zones. They hoped, at first, to return. The papers in their box said the house was theirs. Instead, they learned from notices pinned in camp barracks. The former Eastern territories are no longer part of Germany. Returning is not possible. You will be settled in the Western zones. With a few sentences, their hometown moved from one country to another. Their property became someone else's overnight. They became Heimatloses, people without a homeland. The label Expellee, Vertriebener, did not just describe what had happened. It became a permanent category in registration books, ration card systems, political debates. A number was assigned to them under the LSLLS law to compensate those who had lost property. The law promised payment someday. Hunger demanded solutions now. The Bavarian village, too little for too many. By 1946, Bavaria, traditionally a region of small farms, conservative Catholic politics, and strong local identities, was struggling with a demographic shock. Into villages that had lost, some sons to the front, some barns to requisition. Arrived thousands of expellees from the east, displaced persons from all over Europe. In Johann's new village, the mayor's ledger showed pre-war population 780, current residents 150. Roughly 1 in 3 faces in church on Sunday now came from somewhere else. The locals called them Flüchtlinge, refugees, Schlesier, Ostler, Easterners, sometimes more crudely, Rucksackdeutscher, backpack Germans, or simply more mouths. Housing math became zero awesome. 1 farmhouse, 2 families. 1 farmhouse, 2 families. 1 barn, now a dormitory. The Mayer family saw their hayloft turned into quarters. Boards were laid, straw spread, a small stove installed after arguments over who would pay for the chimney pipe. The order from above was clear. Refugees are to be integrated. Accommodation is obligatory. The sentiment below was not. We suffered through the war too, the farmer's wife told a neighbor. Why should we bear the burden of Hitler's lost provinces? For her, the expellees were not primarily victims of Soviet policy or Allied decisions. They were symbols of a war the Nazis had started and the countryside now had to pay for. The barn as home, hierarchy under one roof. On their first night in the loft, Johann's children shivered despite blankets. Through the cracks in the planks they could hear the clink of dishes from the kitchen below, the muffled voices of the farm family. They smelled soup with more meat than they had seen in months. Their own supper was bread, a thin stew from a camp kitchen pot. Officially, the Mayer family was required to provide reasonable support to their charges. In practice, reasonable was interpreted narrowly. The new residents received access to the pump, a corner of the garden for vegetables, occasional leftovers. Everything else passed through the bureaucracy of ration cards, clothing allocation centers. In the village, invisible hierarchies formed, locals with land, locals without land, expellees without land, expellees with only their hands, expellees with only their hands. Even among the displaced, lines appeared: Silesians, Sudeten Germans, East Prussians. Each group sure that their suffering was the greatest. At the pump, local women hissed, "They arrive with nothing and think they can tell us how to farm." In the loft, Johann's wife retorted under her breath, "They have roofs. We had troops in our kitchens. Let them swap once before complaining." The state spoke of integration. Daily life felt like an occupation of a different sort. Ration cards, registration, and the new categories of existence. The war had ended, the paper war intensified. In the nearest town, Johann queued outside an office marked Landesamt für Flüchtlingswesen, State Office for Refugee Affairs. He was assigned Ich Flüchtlingsausweis, Carriage Affairs, a refugee ID confirming he had been displaced from territories east of the Oder-Neisse line. Ration cards with extra staples for children, a place on a waiting list for proper housing. Each card reduced his family to names, birth dates, category, expellee from Silesia. He understood why the bureaucracy was needed. Without lists, chaos. Without categories, no policy. Still, he wrote, they say expellees as if it were a profession. I was a carpenter. My father was a carpenter. My grandfather was a carpenter. My grandfather was a carpenter. Now we are seekesses in an office ledger. Meanwhile, political arguments flared above their heads. Expellee organizations formed, demanding recognition and compensation. Locals complained that refugees received too many benefits. The Allied authorities worried that expellee agitation about the lost Eastern territories might stir up nationalism. On the ground, the arithmetic remained simple: 1 loaf, 5 mouths. 1 job opening, 10 applicants, 6 of them from the East. Resentment could be predicted like weather. Sunday at church, a crowded God. In the village church, pews filled beyond capacity. The priest, a man in his 50s who had survived both Catholic conflict with the Nazis and Allied bombing, now faced a different challenge: 2 congregations, locals who had been baptized, married, and mourned there for generations. Expellees who had left their own churches, choirs, saints behind. At first, the priest mentioned them cautiously from the pulpit. We must not forget our brothers and sisters from the East who have lost everything. Charity is our Christian duty. Some heads nodded. Others stared straight ahead. Expellees brought their own devotions, prayers for a return to their lost Heimat. Songs in slightly different dialects. Songs in slightly different dialects. One Sunday after Mass, Villagers knelt at a side altar decorated with a hand-painted sign, "For our fallen sons." Johann lit a candle there too. A local man glared. "That is for our boys," he snapped. "Yours are over there." He jerked his chin toward the door, as if their dead lay outside the village boundary. It dawned on Johann that grief, like land, was jealously guarded. He wrote, "Here, sorrow has a parish. Ours is foreign, even in mourning." The church, which once might have softened boundaries, now sometimes hardened them. Work, skill against suspicion. As the economy slowly stirred in the late 1940s, the village needed repairs to farm equipment, new furniture, carpentry for rebuilt barns and houses. Johann saw an opening. He offered his labor initially for food instead of cash, fix a broken wagon in exchange for potatoes, build a cabinet in exchange for flour. Some locals accepted grudgingly. Others objected. "First they take our barns, now they take our work." At the district labor office, a clerk explained the policy. Expellees are to be integrated into the labor market as quickly as possible. Your skills are needed. But, he leaned closer, don't undercut the locals' prices too much. We don't need more trouble. Integration had invisible rules. Work, but not too successfully. Settle, but don't overshadow. When a farmer complimented his craftsmanship, then added, "Pity you're not from here," it was both praise and boundary. He was useful. He was not one of them. Politics of loss, using expellees as symbols. As the new Federal Republic of Germany formed in 1949, with Bonn as its capital, political parties discovered that expellees were not just mouths and luggage. They were also voters, Väter, symbols. Parties courted them with promises. The symbols. Parties courted them with promises. The bright to the homeland and eventual peaceful revision of borders. Expellee parties demanded stronger language about the injustice of expulsions. In town halls, representatives gave speeches. "We have not forgotten Silesia, East Prussia, the Sudetenland. Your loss is Germany's loss." In the barn loft, listening to a tinny radio, Johann heard slogans about a right to the homeland, even as he patched a leaking roof beam in Bavaria. He wrote, "They speak of us to attack Poland, to attack the Oder-Rheinicy line, to attack the Oder-Rheinicy line to win votes. But when we ask for more coal ration in winter, they say the budget is exhausted." His suffering became a bargaining chip in foreign policy, a badge in domestic politics. But when his daughter needed new shoes, the speech texts were of no use. Children of no fixed Heimat. For Johann's children, the barn loft and then, later, a small, newly built house on the village edge were all they remembered. Their Silesian birthplace existed only in stories told at night, a faded photograph of a house door, the smell of dishes their mother cooked from memory. At school, their classmates called them Silesia as a tease, or Zecken, ticks, parasites. Ticks, parasites. Teachers following new curricula taught that Nazi crimes had led to defeat. The loss of the Eastern Territories was a consequence. One teacher added, "And we must not allow feelings of revenge to poison our new democracy." The children of expellees sat in those classrooms, absorbing a strange message. Your parents' loss is real. Your parents' claim to that land is politically inconvenient. At home, they heard, "One day, maybe, we will go back." On the radio, they heard diplomats saying, "The borders are not final." On the playground, they heard, "Go back where you came from." But there was nowhere to go back to. The house in Silesia likely had new residents now, perhaps a Polish family who had themselves been expelled from eastern Poland by the Soviets. The chain of dispossession went eastwards, one village after another, from barn to bungalow, the slow solidifying of displacement. By the early 1950s, West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, began. Factories in cities boomed. Rural areas modernized more slowly, but even villages saw new houses rising, tractors replacing horses. Programs funded by the federal government and the Slastenausgleich compensation scheme provided loans and materials for building. Expellee families, including Johann's, could apply. After mountains of paperwork asking again for proof of property they no longer owned, they received a modest grant, the right to build a small house on the edge of the village. The house had 2 rooms downstairs, a low attic, a patch of garden. It was less than the brick house in Silesia. It was infinitely more than the barn. On the day they moved in, his wife cried quietly as she unpacked the wooden box. Out came the documents again. She placed them in the new kitchen cupboard. "A house is a house," she said. But Johann noticed that locals still called the settlement of such houses das Flüchtlingsviertel, the refugee quarter. Official addresses changed. Labels in heads took longer. Memory versus adaptation, 2 strategies for survival. Among expellees in the village, 2 broad patterns emerged. Some held tight to Silesian customs, dialect, annual commemorations of our lost homeland. They formed local branches of expellee associations, hung maps of pre-war borders on walls, insisted that they were only temporarily here. Others, like Johann, gradually chose a different path, joined the volunteer fire brigade. Vote in local elections. Let their children speak in the local Bavarian dialect. He attended one expellee meeting in a nearby town. Men spoke passionately. Our right to the homeland is inalienable. One day, justice will prevail. On the wall, a banner showed the coats of arms of lost regions. He listened, felt the pull of nostalgia, then thought of his children walking to school past cows in Bavaria, not chimneys in Silesia. He wrote, "My children's Heimat is here, whether I like it or not. If I fix my eyes always on the east, I will never see the street in front of my door." Memory was necessary. But as a basis for politics, he began to suspect it could be a trap. The invisible comparison war, who suffered more. In many German communities after 1945, conversations turned into contests. Bombed-out city dwellers versus rural villagers. Front soldiers versus those who endured air raids. Expellees versus locals. Each group measured its pain against the others, often forgetting even larger crimes beyond German borders. In the pub, a local farmer slammed his beer down and said, "Don't talk to me of suffering. We lost 2 sons, one in Russia, one in Italy." "You only lost a house." Johann replied softly, "I lost my brother in Russia too, and my house, and my village, and the graves of my grandparents. How many things must one lose to be allowed to say it hurts?" The room fell silent for a moment. Then someone changed the subject. There was little room in these comparisons for the Polish families now in his old house who had been expelled from Lviv. The Jewish families with no house, no village, no grave to visit. West Germany's early memory culture centered around its own fallen, its own destruction, its own expulsions. Only slowly, under pressure from younger generations and revelations about Nazi crimes, did that circle widen. For expellees, this evolution posed a dilemma: how to honor their loss without denying or eclipsing others' suffering. Few had easy answers. The slow shift from refugee to neighbor. By the 1960s, the labels on ration cards and refugee IDs began to matter less. Practical signs of belonging accumulated. The village cemetery had a new row of graves, names ending in "esky", alongside old Bavarian names. Birthplaces in Silesia, Sudetenland, East Prussia, engraved beneath dates. In parish records, baptisms listed parents as "from here", with only a note in small letters, refugee origin. The children of Expellee wedding photos no longer showed two separate tribes. In a municipal council meeting, now enlarged by population growth, a proposal was debated, paving the road leading to the refugee quarter. A local councillor grumbled, "Why waste money out there?" Another replied, "My son lives there now. He married Johanna, you know, Keller's girl. It's not out there. It's our village, without a proclamation, without a ceremony. Integration happened not in grand speeches, but in shared roofs, intertwined family trees, common complaints about taxes and weather. Expellee as identity, not destiny. Old age crept up on Johann sooner than it did on men who had not walked for weeks in winter with everything on a cart. His joints ached from years of carpentry and barn work. He sat more often under the apple tree in the small Bavarian garden, watching grandchildren play. They knew Silesia only as a word on their grandfather's lips. For them, Poland was a country on the other side of an Iron Curtain line taught in school, not a place of return. Occasionally, expellee organizations organized bus trips to the former homelands for those who dared cross the East-West divide. Passports, visas, careful itineraries. He thought about going back once, then decided against it. "I am not sure what I would find," he wrote. "A house with strangers, or a patch of grass where a house once stood. Either way, it would not give me back my 20s. He did not stop thinking of himself as a Silesian. But he also acknowledged, in one of his last notebook entries, "If Heimat means only the place where I was born, then mine was taken. If it means where my children grew, where my dead lie, where my tools hang, then it is here." The category expellee, designed as an administrative label, had served its purpose and expired. What remained was a more complicated identity no form could capture. Mouths and luggage and something more. Post-war Europe's grand strategies spoke of population transfers, ethnic homogenization, stability through borders aligned with peoples. In practice, those policies turned millions into columns on roads, lines in ledgers, barn dwellers in villages far from where they began. In rural Bavaria, the arrival of Silesian, Sudeten, East Prussian expellees changed voting patterns, church attendance, property ownership. It also forced locals to confront a truth uncomfortable for a society tempted to see itself primarily as victim, that Germans were not only bombed out and displaced, they had also been perpetrators and beneficiaries of a regime whose aggression set all these movements in motion. Johann's life contained this contradiction. He had watched in silence as Jewish neighbors disappeared. He had then been driven from his own home by a wave of history partly unleashed by the regime he had tolerated. In his last written lines, he did not seek to equate these experiences, only to place them side by side. We were not driven out because we were innocent. We were driven out because our state had done terrible things, and others now did terrible things to us. This does not cancel our pain. It explains why few cried for us. Civil life in post-war Germany for people like him was not a clean arc from victimhood to justice. It was an ongoing negotiation between memory and adaptation, between the house that no longer existed and the bungalow that did, between the churchyard left behind and the new grave in Bavarian soil, between being mouths and luggage in official eyes and being, eventually, simply neighbors. The war in Europe ended in 1945 on maps and in surrender documents. For the displaced Silesian in a Bavarian village, it ended much later, perhaps only when his grandchildren grew up, never having to ask whether they would be allowed to stay where they slept.